Hello chess friends and welcome to Zarov's chess channel and welcome to the Airthings Masters tournament in 2020. Today with another great gameplay by Magnus Carlsen against Daniil Dubov. Daniil Dubov always a dark horse in every tournament. He can beat basically anyone, and in my opinion this is really the game that I've been waiting for. I wanted to see what Daniil Dubov can do against the world champion Magnus Carlsen, because Daniil Dubov played really attractive chess so far in the tournament, and this was for me so far the most important game to watch. So at the end of the video I'm going to also reveal you some interesting facts about the game, but let's now start the analysis. Here Magnus opened with the move e4, and at the end of the video I'm going to reveal you also the current standings. So e4 played by Magnus. We have c5 by Dubov, knight to f3, we have knight to c6 and bishop to b5, the so-called Nezhmedinov attack, Rosolimo-Nezhmedinov attack. It's a positional idea. We want to create here further weaknesses. With bishop takes c6 after d takes or b takes c6, we would have then on black side a double pawn structure, which could be maybe a long-term weakness to attack. In the game g6, which is I think the best way, at least one of the best ways to play against this setup. If you play a6, then you're weakening here after bishop takes c6, maybe b takes or d takes c6. You see this light square bishop has then troubles to develop itself, because you would place many pawns on light square. So that's why, in my opinion, it's best to wait here and simply play the move g6 with the bishop to g7 preparations. If white wants to give up the bishop pair immediately, then of course he can do it, but at least you don't have to weaken your pawn structure further with the move a6. So castling bishop to g7, Magnus takes. Finally, we have b takes c6, and now rook to e1. This rook to e1 is a very important idea of the Rosolimo or Nezhmedinov attack, because if you notice, white has played so far on a great and fast developing style. What we can notice, we want to crack the position with the move e5. When we manage to do that, then we would have really an advanced pawn on the 5th rank, and basically we're building the attack around this advanced pawn. A d6 move by black is very dangerous, because it can be met with a very aggressive e5 move. Then you would have some troubles. You have to play maybe something like d5, and then we can play d3 and maybe something like bishop to g5, and I think this is still playable for white. So here in the game, Daniil Dubov played a very interesting idea. It's not a novelty or something. This position has been played many times in chess history. Knight to h6. We don't want to play with pawns. That's the most important thing for black's perspective. Black doesn't want to weaken the pawn structure with e6 or d6. As I said, d6 can be met with e5, but even an e6 move, let's go back, could be met with an e5 move. We can then really have a great space advantage, and then play something like d3, bishop to g5, and occupy here really the dark square problems that black could have in front of the king. So here, after the move knight to h6, Magnus goes c3, similar to the Alpin setup. So we want to create now a pawn breakthrough motif with d4, and then we could have two connected pawns here in the center. So Dubov responded with castling d4, c takes d4, c takes d4, and now d5. Very important move, because if you play again a passive move like d6, white will develop with knight to c3 and will have a very powerful control of the center. Then afterwards, I think the main goal is to play the move h3, prevent the spinning idea by the bishop. But still, even if bishop to g4 happens, still we can kick it away with h3. Then black has to give up maybe bishop to f3, queen to f3. Black has to give up the bishop here, so it's playable again for both sides, but maybe slightly better for white. So after the move c takes d4, Dubov plays the most aggressive line. He wants now Magnus to play the move e5. He wants a clarification in the center. This move d5 is forcing now really a clarification, because if you take even e takes d5, then c takes d5, and I think with the bishop pair, black is much better. We could play bishop to f5 or knight to f5, then knight to d6, knight to e4. This could be also sort of a path for the knight. We could play something like bishop to a6, and I think also a good idea is to play a rook to b8, attacking maybe the weak b2 pawn, because then the bishop would be stuck a little bit here on c1 and couldn't develop. So that's why Magnus had to play the move e5. We have f6 by Dubov. He breaks the position around this advanced pawn, which is very important. As I said, white has the main advantage, this advanced pawn on e5. So here Magnus plays also a very important move, h3. Now there would be a positional threat. Let's see, if you play something like knight to c3, then bishop to g4 is very, very dangerous. You see, then f takes e5 could happen, queen to c7. We could attack this pawn further. We have a pinning idea. We could even try queen to b6 followed with knight to f5. Is also very dangerous because we would remove the key defender of the d4 square. It's of course the knight. Very, very dangerous position then for white. I think then black would be much, much better. So after move h3, very important and prophylactic move by Magnus Carlsen, Daniil Dubov simply took f takes e5. We have d takes e5. Still Magnus has now this advanced pawn, the space advantage, which is basically showing where white should attack, because this advanced pawn is on the king side, so that's why white should make progress on that side of the board. On the other hand, you see black has here two advanced pawns on the queen side, so that's why black is going to attack probably the queen side. But the problem is now still it's very risky to play the move c5, but basically you have to do it because this is a backward pawn and you need to improve it. That's why c5 immediately by Daniil Dubov. And now comes the move b4. b4 is a gambit line. It has been also played in chess history, this particular position. It seems like a strange idea by Magnus Carlsen, but it's sort of a necessary move. It's risky, but it's really necessary. You have to do it, because if you leave your opponent with these two advanced pawn, then I think black could cement the position here with the move e6, would play something like queen to c7 or queen to b6, then maybe even something like bishop to a6. This two advanced pawn I think is something that would bother white in the continuation of the game, so that's why Magnus breaks the position with move b4. You could play c4, but then I think you leave also some here dark square problems, so we would play something like maybe bishop to e3, bishop to d4, knight to c3, and then we could proceed here with a 2 versus 1 situation on the queen side, and I think also that white could have a comfortable game. So after move c takes b4, a3 was played, and now d4 by Daniil Dubov, which is kind of a risky move because you're losing another pawn. But let's see a possible continuation. If you take bishop takes b takes a3, then bishop to a3, and you see now this bishop comes very active into the game. If you try something like rook to e8 to get out of the range of the bishop, then knight to c3, very, very healthy move. Let's see, maybe e6, then knight to b5. That's, I think, the great continuation of this gambit line, when you give up maybe the pawn here on the queen side, but now this d6 square is really weak one. If you compete, for instance, with knight to f7, still we can trade bishop to d6, maybe bishop to f8, but again we can trade. And now I think this move would be something that bothers now black all the time. We would play something like knight to g4 and followed with knight to f6. This square I think you cannot protect anymore. Maybe you could play something like h5, but then you're weakening your g6 square. That's really a continuation that I wanted to see why, for instance, Dubov didn't take. But as I said, this bishop comes very active to the game, and you could have trouble here. This bishop would be very, very dangerous. So here in the game, after the move d4, Magnus played now a takes b4. We have bishop to b7, attacking the knight on f3. That's why Magnus develops knight to d2. We have a5, and now after trades of pawns, Daniil Dubov gets active with the king, with the queen out. But still, if we notice, Magnus has now also a weak pawn here on e5. Daniil Dubov has also a weak pawn here on d4. But I think Magnus can hang on to this bishop because he simply took. If you try now, this wasn't played in the game, bishop to e5. Then we can play knight to f3, and here after maybe bishop takes d4, knight to d4. I still think that white is much, much better. First of all, we can notice this knight is hanging. We could also occupy here the e6, but the problem is, I think, the most annoying thing that black will face here is this long diagonal for the dark square bishop. We would simply play something like bishop to b2, maybe even queen to d4, queen to c3. I'm not sure. As a long-term plan, of course, so far it's not possible because the rook is hanging. But we will regroup. We will find a way to activate our pieces, and then we will attack, I think, simply the long diagonal, the long dark square diagonal, and even try to deliver a checkmate on g7. So that's why it's very risky for Dubov to here open the position around the square e5. So that's why Daniil Dubov played knight to f5. We have knight to f3. queen to d5, and now bishop to b2, protecting everything, bishop to h6, and now e6 by Magnus. Very, very intense move, because again we're opening the long diagonal. Now if you try to compete with bishop to g7 on this long diagonal, then again you could face some problems, knight to g5, knight to f7, and even if we trade off, then again you have darker problems. I think white would be again much better. Here in the game e6 was played, and now rook to d8. What I wanted to point you out now, really, so far in the game, it's really incredible that so far Daniil Dubov and Magnus Carlsen didn't play inaccuracies, mistakes, or blunders. Basically, they played maybe the first or second suggested line by the Stockfish engine. The evaluation, it jumps from 0.0 till 0.3. So it's really a perfection so far by both of them, which is really incredible in this fast time format. They played this 15 plus 10 seconds increment game, so it's really incredible. They played almost this game to a perfection, and in such a fast time format, it's really unbelievable. So I'm seeing here also the evaluation. The evaluation now is 0.0, so the evaluation didn't change dramatically here in the game. Dubov defended this position so far very good. In the game queen to e2 played by Magnus, we have queen to d3, Magnus trades off, queen to d3, rook to d3, knight to e4, bishop to e4, and now after rook to e4 we can notice now that white is up to 1 pawn, but still this is playable, because first of all black has this powerful knight on f5. This bishop has also good activity, so what we want to do is to take out maybe this weak pawn and go into a drawish endgame. So bishop to g7. Here we have bishop to e5, bishop takes, knight to e5, still the position is around equal, rook to d1, king to h2, and now king to g7. Here g4, knight to d6 attacking the rook, rook to d3, g5, and now king to g2 played by Magnus. We have h6 fixing the pawn, and now knight to c6 attacking the weak, of course, e7 pawn. In the game Dubov tried to defend. We have rook to f3, and now Magnus takes now the pawn, but still we can play rook to e3 and we can take out now this pawn. Still this is a drawish endgame, because we have a 3 versus 2 situation here. It's very hard now for white to create a pass pawn. If you want to create a pass pawn, you have to push something like f4. Then after g takes f4, still you can maybe create one pass pawn, but you have to support this pass pawn with the knight, with the rook, with the king. So I think black can defend this position, because we have pawns on the same side. If for instance this position would be something like this, 2 versus 2, and maybe one pawn here on the queen side, then the position would be maybe much better for white, because then black's pieces are always deflected to the queen side. But when we have 3 versus 2 on the same side, it's very hard to win this endgame, although up pawn. So knight to c4, rook to e4, we have knight to d6, rook to e2, rook to d3, and now knight to c6. Magnus regroups, tries to search for new and better squares on the board. We have knight to f7, rook to e3. Of course, now that's as I said here, after rook to e3, this wasn't played in game, but after f takes e3, that's our goal basically from white's perspective. We want to create a pass pawn, at least some kind of a pawn that deflects maybe now the knight in the continuation. Now we can move the king, and this would be maybe a winning situation here for white. But when the pawns are still on the same side here, of course Dubov doesn't want to take. He plays rook to d7. We have rook to a3 by Magnus, and now knight to h8, knight to b8 attacking the rook, and again a new check. I think Magnus found now good ways how to activate his pieces. After move king to g7, we have knight to c6, knight to g6, and now knight to d4. And now comes really the critical moment of the game. Here comes really now the most attractive segment of this game. So here Daniil Dubov plays first the correct move, knight to h4. It's perfectly fine, because if you play knight to f4, it seems like maybe more natural to idea to us, because you're getting the knight towards the center. But then you have some troubles, because king to g3 will happen, and then maybe knight to g6 can again happen. If you try knight to f5, okay, still this is defendable, but I don't like this king. The king is always stuck to the defense, and you cannot play freely with your rook, because you you're always risking some checks here on the 7th rank, and if we take out this pawn on h6, then I think it will be a game over. So that's why knight to f4 is not good. Knight to h4 is perfectly fine, because now after king to g3, rook to b1 was played, but again, this was a mistake. Rook to b4 was the move that Daniil Dubov should have played, and this was now the first mistake by Daniil Dubov. It was in the game the move of 47, which was really incredible. 46 moves. Magnus Carlsen and Daniil Dubov played basically in Stockfish level, which was really incredible. Rook to b4 is probably still a drawish line, because you can maybe attack, but you get one check after something like knight to e3. Now maybe we could go behind, threatening some dangerous checks. After f4, we can maybe again pin the knight, rook to e6, and now maybe even something like knight to g6, f5. But now it's time to here attack with the knight to f4. If the rook moves somewhere, it's not a problem. Still, we can create a blockade with our king and defend this position, and I think again this should be a draw. But as I said, instead of this rook to b4 move, Daniil Dubov played a mistake, rook to b1. Now Magnus can play f4, and the problem is now you cannot create a check on b3. You see g takes f4 is a problem, you lose your knight, so that's why here rook to g1, but it's not a problem. King to f2, the rook has again to move in the game. Rook to g2, king to f1, but now you really have to move the rook to d1, and now knight to e6 comes very active into the game. We have king to f7, a new mistake here by Daniil Dubov, because king to h8 is probably better. After f5, we can play knight to f3 and trying maybe some perpetuals with knight to a2 and similar stuff. What Black wants to do here is this perpetual. Let's see, maybe something like rook to b6, but then you risk this idea. You have always the problems that you could run into perpetual check. You see, if you try again with the new check, again we'll try knight to h2. If you try king to g1, again knight to f3, and again if you try king to h1, that's a problem, you get checkmated. So here Black could create a setup, a drawish setup, which I think you should be really familiar with, and this again could be a draw. But here after the move king to f7, Magnus has now the opportunity to take f takes g5, and the problem is now after h takes g5, this check comes again. This knight takes g5 comes with a check, and why Black has to move the king again, which is now a huge problem. But still, the engine suggests here, instead of this knight to f3 move that Daniil Dubov played, still the engine suggests the move knight h takes g5, because okay, knight to g5 can be played, and here the king has to move somewhere. Maybe I'm not sure, but maybe in this fast time format Black could play for draw somehow. Still a weird position here for both sides, but here in the game knight to f3 was played by Daniil Dubov. What he wanted, again, as I said, he wanted this perpetual check with knight to h2, and then this idea that we saw as a defensive idea here to finally get a draw somehow. But it's a problem because Magnus Carlsen played the move g6, and the move g6 is winning immediately. If you take, for instance, king takes g6, then you risk this move knight to d4, discover attack, and you lose the knight to f3. So that's why king to e7 was played. But now Magnus attacks. We have knight to e2, we have king to e1, rook to d6, knight to f4, and here after king to f6, king to e2, the king comes very active into the game. And the most important thing is that this knight is now out of game. It doesn't have good squares to jump here on f3 or on f1. We have now pass pawn. What we want to do is play knight to h5, and then to play g7 further in the game. Rook to a6, very important check. Now after king to e5, here after the move knight to h5, in this position Dubov resigned. So incredible game. You see how Magnus plays this endgames, really incredible stuff. He won the game. And listen to this really important fact. If you put now this PGN into a Stockfish engine, you see now that Magnus Carlsen played this game without inaccuracies, mistakes or blunders. The average centipound loss is here 5. So it was really a Stockfish perfection played by the world champion against Daniil Dubov. And it seems to me that this is basically the game that Magnus Carlsen wanted to win in this tournament. It seems to me that Magnus Carlsen is sometimes not motivated when he plays this rapid games online. It seems to me that he's watching somewhere else, he's doing something else. But in this game against Dubov, he was really focused because he knows probably that Dubov is really one of these guys that can even win this tournament, because Dubov is really such a sharp and attractive player to watch. And I think that Magnus was finally concentrated on this game. He played really, as I said here, a stockfish perfection. Great performance by the world champion. I was really glad when I saw this game. It's not about that I'm rooting for Magnus. I just wanted to see by every player their best play. So I wanted to see also by Dubov his best play, and he played here also almost a perfect game. Played this tiny little inaccuracies in the end game and got outplayed, but they played, as I said, 40 and something moves in stockfish level, which was really incredible. Think about it really more. Great game this was, I think. Even it wasn't maybe so attractive, but this was probably the best game that we have seen so far in the tournament. Incredible performance by both of them, and I still like also the fact that Daniil Dubov won another game in the day 2, so he still has chances to win this tournament. So Daniil Dubov is the only player in this tournament who got 2 wins, which is also something that we should honor and recognize, because he's the most attractive player now to watch. He plays the most attacking and attractive chess, so still Daniil Dubov is in the tournament. He lost the game against Magnus Carlsen, but anyone can lose against Magnus, so that's why so far great performance by both of them. And we have now many players with the same pawn count. We'll see now in the day 3 who move up in the quarterfinal stage. I'm really looking forward. This is so far incredible tournament. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game like I did. If you want to see more games from this tournament, check out my link. I've created a separate playlist. You can maybe also analyze some other games with me. And if you want to see the best chess games of all times, check out my best chess games of all time series. Here's also the link. And if you like this content, you can also subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.